Hello, and welcome to another installment of The Psychology of Better Call Saul. The primary purpose in this series of videos is to make psychological interpretations and analysis of the television show Better Call Saul. This will be accomplished by identifying key drives and motivations for the main characters of the show. In addition, I will create several videos which delve into related topics such as philosophy, mythology, and religion. With these videos, I hope to provide viewers with a more comprehensive view of the show as a whole, in which the characters will be understood on a deeper level. In this video, I am going to look at the character of Mike Ehrmantraut and the way in which he utilizes the psychological function of compartmentalization. By examining the character progression, we can see how Mike attempts to live a life in which he compartmentalizes past distressing events in his life, often leading to unwanted emotions, affects, and behaviors. This leads to his breaking point in Season 5, resulting in him taking on a new form of defense mechanism to replace the old one. Before we examine the progression of the character, we need to better understand what compartmentalization means. In psychological terms, compartmentalization is a process of placing unwanted thoughts or ideas into different sections or compartments of your mind. This is an unconscious process, a defense mechanism that all people employ in their lives. This process takes place when ideas or thoughts are anxiety-provoking or distressing and do not align with the way a person would like to see themselves. If someone engages in an act that goes against their value system, they may compartmentalize that act as a way to avoid the accompanying thoughts and feelings that would cause distress. A classic example of this is when someone is morally opposed to thievery, but is forced to steal because they don't have enough food to feed their hungry family. The tension that is created from this act leads to mental distress, so the mind works to place that experience in a separate compartment so that they can continue living their normal existence without this anxiety. Now that we have a better idea of what this term means, let's look at Mike's character in more depth. Mike is someone who was first presented within the Breaking Bad storyline as a hitman for Gus. We learn in that show that Mike is performing this work in order to save money for his granddaughter's future, but we do not learn much else regarding where he came from or what other motivations might be present for the character. We learn in Season 1 that Mike was formerly a police officer in Philadelphia, and that Mike's son followed in his footsteps and became a cop as well. When Mike's son becomes involved with the dirty cops within the district, he lands in a position which ends up getting him murdered. In Season 1, Episode 6, Mike talks about how many of the cops he worked with were dirty, that practically all the cops in the area were dirty, but that his son was not. Mike also admits that he himself was part of those dirty cops for a period of time. Mike has come to believe that he was partially to blame for his son's death, not only because his son admired him and wanted to be a cop like his dad, but also because Mike was a dirty cop, like those that were the direct cause of his son's death. Although these events preside in the past, Mike is still driven by the guilt of what happened to his son, believing that if he did not lead his son down that path, that he might still be alive today. Mike's guilty feelings and thoughts about the past have driven him to New Mexico, in which he hopes to provide for his daughter-in-law and granddaughter, who are struggling in the years following the death of Mike's son. In New Mexico, Mike begins engaging in criminal tasks as a way to help financially provide for his family. He feels guilty since they are living in a rough neighborhood, so he must acquire enough money to get them into a better house. Mike begins the process of riding the line between the criminal world and the world of the regular citizen. He not only compartmentalizes his current actions, telling himself that what he is doing is okay as long as it is helping his son's family, but he does the same with past events, storing them away in his memory, hoping they do not come to the surface. Part of Mike's code becomes that he will not kill anyone, which serves the purpose of keeping his mind clear of the idea of being a criminal. In Season 2, Episode 4, Mike has been beaten up badly by Tuco while trying to help Nacho. Nacho thinks Mike should have killed Tuco, but Mike refused to do so. Nacho says, "You went a long way not to pull that trigger. Why?" Mike doesn't respond to this question. Mike has created an invisible line for himself not to cross. As long as he does not kill anyone, he is not officially in the criminal world, and therefore does not need to identify with those dirty cops that caused his son's death. In Season 3, Episode 3, we begin to see cracks in the armor that Mike has attempted to construct. When Hector kills a civilian in relation to a failed drug delivery, Mike becomes enraged and later discusses these events with Gus. Mike says to Gus, he wasn't in the game. Mike is viewing the civilian through the scope of his son, who was also not in the game and was a helpless bystander to the dealings of the criminal underworld. Mike is consumed with the pursuit of Salamanca for several episodes, as he seems to be obsessing over this man. Mike believes that he is pursuing Salamanca as a way to provide revenge for the civilian, but really he is being unconsciously driven by the pain that he still experiences in relation to his son's death. Mike is using Salamanca as a substitute for those responsible for his son's death, as a civilian provides the perfect replacement object. In the following episode, Gus says to Mike,
"If I may make an observation, perhaps you are trying to correct something which cannot be corrected."
Gus understands what is unconsciously driving Mike, and we will see later on how Gus uses this to his advantage. One of the ways we see Mike attempting to distract from his past painful memories is by keeping himself busy. In Season 4, Episode 4, we see Mike begin to be heavily involved in the inspection of Madrigal. Even though Mike was never asked to do this job, he takes it upon himself to complete the quality assurance. He had just quit his toll booth job, has enough money for both he and his family, and has no other uses for his time. Part of the problem for Mike is that idle time for him means more time to think about the past and his guilt. Similar to his tendency to stay busy or distracted, we also see Mike using alcohol as a coping mechanism throughout the series. Alcohol provides another way to distract himself from painful memories that he has stored deep within his mind. We come to understand through these scenes that Mike is constantly being driven into behaviors that serve the purpose of distracting from the past. Certain kinds of escapism occur when you need to mentally move away from something that is stressful, upsetting, or overwhelming. When you put yourself out of your mind, you are intentionally sidelining that experience, engaging in an activity, distracting yourself, steering your focus onto something different, all give a temporary respite from what might be troubling you. In Season 4, Episode 8, Mike is seen starting to become close with Ziegler. During these episodes, Mike grows fond of this man, and they begin to learn about each other's lives. Although Mike is Ziegler's boss and has been assigned to make sure things run smoothly, Mike seems to let his guard down with him. Mike has placed emotional barriers around him in attempts to consciously protect himself from forming any type of new relationship. As stated previously, Mike created an invisible line in the sand in which he planned not to kill anyone during his criminal acts. The last time Mike engaged in this act is when he killed the cops who were responsible for his son's death, enacting his revenge. Mike created this line in the sand not only to quell the anxiety of being a bad guy, but also as a way to not remind himself of the events of the past. In the beginning of Season 5, Mike experiences the aftermath of having killed Ziegler. Not only has his act made him cross that invisible line, causing a reliving of past events, but he killed someone who he formed a relationship with, making him that much more vulnerable to the pain. This act seems to flood him with emotion and all the thoughts he was trying to keep out of mind. In Season 5, Episode 2, following a heavy night of drinking, Mike is asked to take care of his granddaughter. He is completely hungover, but is attempting to grit through the day when she begins speaking about Mike's son and the fact that he decided to be a cop like Mike. She then mentions the fact that he died due to becoming a cop. The combination of his recent acts and the conscious process of connecting himself to his son's death causes him to lash out at his granddaughter, the one person he cares most about in life. The ability to separate his worlds has become impossible at this time, and his behaviors are showing the effects from this inability to compartmentalize. He is no longer able to curb the thoughts and emotions he has worked so hard to keep separate. He has been attempting to live in a reality in which his son was not murdered, and in which he himself is not partly responsible for that death. But now that is no longer possible. He must face this reality. Mike soon becomes nihilistic and is drinking heavily and looking for fights in the street. In Season 5, Episode 3, he is unable to deal with the guilt and the reality of who he is as a person. Although Mike's ability to compartmentalize has come crashing down, Gus appears to be the savior who will provide Mike with a new way to go about this process. Mike created the belief in his mind that he wasn't one of those guys, one of those dirty cops or criminals that he was working with at current time. He was telling himself that he was something different, and that all he was trying to do was take care of his granddaughter and daughter-in-law. After Mike is critically beaten in Season 5, Episode 5, Gus sends him to Mexico as a way to restore his health while also providing him the chance to think about things and remove himself from everyday concerns. When Gus appears, Mike is upset and unsure as to why he was brought to this place. Gus shows Mike a fountain that he dedicated to the town, a place where Gus seems to be taking care of the townspeople. Mike can't seem to wrap his head around the idea of a person like Gus, who does such terrible things, also being able to take care of people and be good in other parts of his life. Mike says,
"The anonymous benefactor. Well, that must make you feel pretty good. And is that supposed to balance the scales? Make up for everything else you do?"
Mike doesn't understand how Gus can do this because he had been struggling so hard not to be that dirty cop, while also being a person who was taking care of his son's family. His mental processes had led him to rejecting the idea that he can be bad in one part of his life while still serving good in another. For Mike, it was all or nothing. He was either all good or all bad, and his former process of compartmentalization was helping him maintain that illusion of the person he thought he was. But in this scene, Gus is offering Mike a new solution, a new path. He says that instead of trying not to be a killer or one of those bad people he didn't want to believe he was, maybe instead he can change course. He reminds him that they both have something in common, the need for revenge and justice. This is what was referenced earlier when speaking about how Gus will use things to his advantage. He shows Mike that he can continue seeking out revenge for the things that have happened in the past, just as Gus continues to do so. Essentially, Gus implants in Mike's head the process of another unconscious defense mechanism, displacement. Displacement is the redirection of an impulse, usually aggression, onto a powerless substitute target. The target can be a person or an object that can serve as a symbolic substitute. In Season 5, Episode 7, we see how this conversation has benefited Mike. While speaking with his daughter-in-law, he seems to be in good spirits, and she notices and asks what is going on.
"I'm better now."
What changed?
Decided to play the cards I was dealt.
Essentially, he is saying that he has stopped trying to fight against the idea of being a bad guy, one of those people responsible for his son's death, and instead commit to the act of killing and being that bad guy. The reason this works is because he has found a new way for transferring the aggressive energy he has been repressing. In Season 5, Episode 8, we see Mike killing multiple people without hesitation, in the scene where Jimmy is in the desert and needs help. He is now using the act of killing others as a way to displace his pent-up anger towards himself and the past events in his life. He can now commit to being a bad guy in one world, while being his family's savior in another. The anxiety and distress he was trying to deal with by being a good guy in all worlds is now being dealt with by the defense mechanism of displacement, in which he transfers that aggression to the targets that are continually being supplied within the criminal world. He has not dealt with his son's death. He has just found a new unconscious process that helps him to deal with it more effectively. This concludes this installment from the series on Better Call Saul. Please watch my other videos regarding other characters if you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching.